So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're really happy to welcome Dr. Veronda Montgomery. She is MSU Foundation Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and Microbiology and Molecular Genetics at Michigan State University. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Academy of Microbiology, and the American Society of Plant Biologists. She was named one of Cell's 100 Inspiring Black Scientists in America. And today we're going to discuss Beronda's new book, Lessons from Plants. And this book considers how plants can teach us about living in our world more effectively and also supporting others in our environment more effectively. So welcome, Beronda, and maybe I'll just set us up here with a question. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about your background and your areas of research. And also, we're very interested to hear about how you came up with the idea to write about how plants can teach us about leadership and mentoring.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. And thank you to everyone who's in attendance. A little bit about my background is that no one, including me, expected that I would be a plant biology professor. I grew up with plants. My mother is an amazing houseplant grower and gardener, but I had always thought that I would be a lawyer all the way through college, and became interested in biology and math during probably middle school, the equivalent of middle school, early high school. So was majoring in biology, but with the full intention of being a patent lawyer. I was very much drawn to the law. And ultimately, the opportunity to be involved in experiments myself as an undergraduate led me to think about being an experimental scientist, and taking a few classes led me slowly towards plants. So I took a plant physiology class, and I always like to share that I took this class because it was the only class that would count that fit into my schedule. I wasn't drawn to taking a plant physiology class, but I took this class and the professor was extremely engaging. And I was drawn into the idea that prior to the class, I thought plants were pretty boring. And to find out all the fascinating biology and behaviors that they exhibit, I was really drawn into the idea of studying plants. And one of the first things I studied was this phenomenon when leaves, particularly on things like maples and oaks, emerge in spring. The young leaves are bright red for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they green up. And I was very interested in what that transient period of red pigment accumulation was. So I studied that, initially thinking it was serving as a sunscreen, like for UV light and that kind of thing, and slowly got very interested in plants. And the thing that still interests me most about plants is their ability to show very different forms of growth and behavior depending on what's going on outside. So many of us have had a plant in our home that bends towards the window, and that kind of turning towards the window is seeking out light because plants need light for photosynthesis. But that's a very demonstrative point of view that plants are able to really change what they look like in the search for external factors. And humans, we are in the class of animals that have to actively move to search out those kinds of things, whereas plants can change. We can't grow taller if we can't reach something, but plants can do that if they can't reach the sun. So I've been very fascinated with that. And in fact, that's what my lab studies, how plants, because they spend their entire life cycle in one place, they have to constantly be aware of what's going on around them and matching their behaviors to that. And we study how they understand what light cues are available and what that tells them about what time of year it is. So I live in Michigan, and the days are growing shorter, and the plants are measuring the hours of light they get to tell them that winter is coming and to prepare for that. Likewise, in summer, they measure that. They also can measure how many nutrients are available and understand if they have enough nutrients to fruit or flower. So we are really interested in how they know what's available and then how they translate that into a cue about what kind of behaviors and growth patterns they should demonstrate. In terms of how I came to believe that plants could serve as teachers for us about things like mentoring and leadership, this idea that plants are so much attuned to their external environment one of the things that we know is if you take two seeds that are identical, exactly identical, and they have different access to external conditions. So if one of them is in the dark and one is in the light, what they look like is very different. And what that tells us is that the external environment is one of the most important things that determines whether plants are able to live up to their purpose or their aptitude. And the more I thought about that, it just seemed to me that there were some really strong lessons for that for us as humans about how we often look at people who have equal aptitude, and if there are distinct outcomes, we make a judgment about that individual, whether they worked hard enough, whether they were smart enough, or whether they have individual deficits. We very rarely ask, was the external environment appropriate to support their growth and development? And so it just seemed to me that there were some really powerful lessons there. And one of the most powerful things about humans and plants that continues to really inspire my belief that plants have a lot to teach us about mentoring, which is supporting others, or leadership, which is leading others, is what I think of as an awe-inspiring relationship that humans have with plants. And that's that the default expectation for most humans is that plants should grow. If we have a plant in our space, our default expectation for 99% of humans or more is that the plant should grow and be healthy. And that's demonstrated by the fact that if there is a plant in our environment that's not healthy, we start to ask questions about what's going on with it. If it's wilting, does it need water? If it's yellowing, does it need nutrients? And that's because we expect growth and health. And any departure from that, we ask questions about the environment, or we will admit that maybe we're not good caretakers. And that to me says that if we expect growth, we respond differently to organisms. And I just started to ask questions about what if we had similar expectations of growth and health of people who we shared space with? And if we saw departures from that, would we ask questions about what's missing in their environment, or whether we're a good person and steward to be in relationship with them? And so I really started to draw lessons from that, what I think of as an awe-inspiring relationship that we have with plants, to ask if we could transfer some of those behaviors to others through our leadership and mentoring and being in community.
Excellent. So that would lead me to just wonder what the experience of, as a research scientist, what the experience of writing a book for sort of a popular audience has been like, and then sharing that book as you do these kinds of events. And I wonder how the conversation might be changing as you've been doing more and more of these events over the past year.
Yeah, so it's been a very interesting journey, I would say. And I was invited to consider writing a book after giving a public talk at a conference. And the person who became my acquisition editor was there and asked me if I had ever thought about writing a book. And to be quite frank, it's not common for professors in my domain to write books. Books are much more likely to come out of English or the social sciences. It's not a highly common thing for biochemistry professors to write books. And if we do, we usually write a textbook. But I was drawn to the idea because I consider myself a writer first. As a young person, I thought I would be a poet until I realized my poetry wasn't very good. And so I was able to, exercise my love for writing through writing technical papers. But I've always loved to write. So when I got the idea, when I was asked if I might write a book, I thought, oh, maybe. And initially, I thought I would write a much more technical book for academics. But I did mention this fascination I had with sharing stories, analogies from plants. And the way I first started using analogies from plants was for two purposes. I have always tried to, all of my family, my biological family, there are no other scientists, and they can be quite befuddled at the pure amount of time that I spend loving science in the laboratory. And so part of this was a way to try to invite them into all the beautiful things that I have learned about plants over the years. I wanted to talk accessibly about that in a way that my mother, who loves plants, and my other family members who aren't scientists could be brought into the science. So I wanted to write very accessibly. I also wanted a book that I hoped would serve that purpose for some of my plant science colleagues who might want to invite their family members into their work. So very accessible. And as I started to write some of the stories, we realized, the editing team, that this could be a book that was broadly open to the public. I had no idea. I think, part of life, part of success in life is preparation, but the biggest part is serendipity and chance. And so I wrote this book hoping it would be interesting to the public. And then the pandemic hit. And there was a great affinity for plants and houseplant growing during the pandemic. And so I think there was a collision of things where I wanted to write this book to invite people into my enthusiasm for plants, from my family to others. But also, I have just learned so much from plants over the years that I wanted to try to have some conversations about our place on the planet as humans, some difficult topics, how we are in community, diversity and equity, but to do it through a lens that I thought would invite people into the conversation in a different way than might have happened in the past, and in a way that reminds us that we are a part of the globe. We're part of a larger ecosystem, and there's a lot of wisdom in many places, not just in other human beings.
Wonderful. Yeah, so including plants as our teacher is really kind of expanding our view of what diversity is and what it means. And I know a lot of us grew up with a hierarchical view of life, with humans at the top, humans not even being animals. So humans are kind of at the very top, and then animals, and then plants, and then minerals. And so this book really widens that view, and it's very interesting to just to look to plants as teachers, and it's just very encouraging to get a completely different viewpoint.
Yes.
And
I think, one of the things that I often think about, because that is our kind of default perspective. I mean, it's the ways in which many of us are taught biology, the pyramid. And, one of the things that I always like to remind us is that we can think of ourselves that way. But the real question is, who can exist without the other? Can humans exist without plants? We cannot. Plants, if we disappear, will carry on. And so we can think of ourselves as hierarchical, but plants don't need us nearly as much as we need them. And so I often tease my son and say, who's really in control? Because the plants will go on just happily, maybe even more happy without us, with the way we're treating the planet right now. But I think more of it as, it's a circle. There's reciprocity. And until we fully embrace that reciprocity, I think it's a disservice for us to just default to those kind of hierarchies that we're taught, without really thinking about how the planet actually functions, where there is a reciprocity, so much reciprocity amongst biological organisms on the planet.
right. What would you say is one of the most important, or what are some of the most important things that we can learn from plants?
Yeah, I think, I think about it in a couple of ways. I think that for so many humans, we think about plants in the context of what they can offer to us, right? They can offer us food, or it's our human kind of default to also think of other biological organisms through our human lens. Like, how are they similar to us? And so one of the lessons I think I always want people to understand is that plants are fascinating in and of themselves, not for the ways in which they kind of mirror our lives. Although I also believe that there is a lot of commonality for biological organisms on the planet. And I guess some of the strongest lessons that I have learned from plants have depended on where I am, kind of in my life. Right now, because I do live in a part of the world where that experiences the seasons, we are in the midst of the big color burst. It's almost peak or just past peak. Leaf color change. And so one of the things that I really think we can learn from plants are the importance of seasonal living. So plants are constantly aware of what's going on external to them. And because it's fall leading into winter, and in winter there's not sufficient energy, or it's too cold for them to carry out photosynthesis, what we are experiencing as a beautiful burst of color is actually an active preparation phase for plants. They are actively preparing for winter. And part of the way they prepare for winter is to shed any parts of themselves that they don't need to exist and survive, to save energy. And to limit damage. So they're dropping leaves in active preparation for a period of rest. They will rest over winter, where they will use all of their energy just to maintain the core parts that they need. And then in spring, we'll see this reemergence and revigoration. So I look at the ways that plants live seasonally and look for really strong lessons from that for us as humans. It's my estimation that I always start with me, I know myself best, but humans by and large, we don't pay attention to seasons as well as we should. And we act as if we're in summer all the time. So in summer, plants have sufficient sunlight, warmth, and everything they need to just basically be active all day. And we exist as humans in kind of constant state of summer where we're working full out all the time. And it's until we burn ourselves out that we go into rest. And when you go into rest from a burnout state, you don't enjoy rest as much as if you prepare for it and you anticipate it and you're longing for it. So I always use the seasonal cues every fall to ask myself, am I listening to the seasons of my life, whatever those are? And I'm older now than I used to be, so the seasons may be different at one stage. But I think we also saw that with the pandemic, right? The pandemic forced us into a much slower pace. For those of us who were fortunate enough not to succumb to the tragedy of COVID, we were forced to rest. We were forced to stop. Like I literally used to be on a plane once or twice a month before the pandemic. And being forced to stop, I had more time to spend with family and friends. I reconnected. And so I think that we often we don't get that rest until we're forced into it. And I think plants show us the wisdom of listening to the seasons in your life and making behavioral changes that allow you to survive and thrive, because you have a much longer life than if you just go all out. I think the other lessons that I think about from plants, some of them are lessons of resilience. I was driving today. There is a chapter in the book on this, but I was driving today through town and I passed the parking lot of an abandoned GM plant. It's been abandoned for about 5 years. And now there's a beautiful plant community that's emerging in the parking lot. And that's because of the resilience and kind of creativity and innovation of plants to grow and thrive in places that you might not expect. So those are some of the lessons I come back to. But I think the biggest kind of lesson I would share from that is that each of those lessons, though different, come from me paying close attention to plants and observing plants. And I think we could do a lot more observation of living beings and our natural ecosystems and you may get different lessons, but it takes us stopping and having time to actually observe and not being in constant motion and constant pursuit of things to really ask what lessons can we learn if we stop and engage with the living beings around us.
That's beautiful. So I'm going to keep asking questions. If anybody wants to jump in, you can, or you can put a question in the chat and I'll read it out. So yeah, this is, Veronda has the copy of the book behind her, but this is the, oh, I can't see it here, but it's, oh, there you go. There we go. That's better. We do have a couple of copies. This one will be added, so we'll have 3 at the library that you're welcome to put a hold on. So let's see. So can we talk a little bit about the value of collaboration and reciprocity over competition, and also the collective or the ecosystem view over the individual view, which we're kind of stuck in the individual view a lot of the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that is a really strong and great lesson, I think, that emerges from looking at natural ecosystems, and plants certainly have some beautiful examples. So I often have been known to say that plants are much more wise competitors than are humans. So as humans, we have, by and large, this kind of over competitiveness where when we compete, I have to compete not just to get past you to what I need, but we compete to the death until one of us must be obliterated from the space. And I think that when you look at how competition often happens for plants, plants compete. They compete for access to resources, just like we compete for resources. Plants will compete for access to light because light is everything for them in terms of using light energy to produce sugars. They will compete for access to nutrients. If you look at the roots in the soil, the roots are often competing. But the ways in which plants compete is that if you have two plants that are growing next to each other and they're the same height, and one of them starts to grow taller, the taller one will cast shade on the other one. So there now is a competition for access to sunlight. And what happens in that case is, sensing that you're in a less optimal environment, the other plant will start to grow taller. And generally what plants will do is just grow just tall enough to get access to light. So they compete just enough to get access to resources, and then they use their energy for other behaviors. And so competition is really about survival, not complete obliteration of the other plant. And I think that we have some lessons to learn for that, because we often compete so much that in the end we're hoarding, as opposed to just competing for what we need and leaving the other resources there for access. I think one of the other beautiful lessons are the ways in which plants collaborate. And one of the most known collaborations are with legumes or beans, where the roots of those plants will collaborate with bacteria in the soil. So nitrogen is critical for plants as a fertilizer. It's one of the things that's in Miracle-Gro or other commercial fertilizers that you might buy. And nitrogen is in the air, but plants have to have that fixed into a form that they can take up by their roots. And bacteria have the ability to do that. And so plants will collaborate with bacteria, where they make, if you pull the plants out of the soil for beans, they're these little, look like little pearls that decorate the roots. Those are actually houses that the plant has made, and the bacteria lives inside of those houses. The bacteria makes the nitrogen in a form of fertilizer to share with the plant. And in return, the plant gives some sugar to the bacterium. So there's this reciprocity and collaboration for growth. And so the ways in which plants collaborate with many different organisms, including each other, is the idea that they both in collaboration can survive better than if they try to just be in isolation and compete. And I think when we look at the ways in which collaboration is often the default choice over individual in the plant and animal kingdom, humans, particularly in the US, but in some global cases, we have this individualistic. We survive and celebrate when we have individual success, and often prize that over collaborative or community-based success. And when you look at plant communities, those that collaborate, often the community itself, the ecosystem, survives longer than any of the individual plants. And so it's really this idea that I am a part of a larger ecosystem, and the ways in which I function impact not just me, but the ecosystem as a whole. And if we made decisions understanding that, as opposed to just how it enriches my own individual life, I think there are a lot of lessons that we could learn from how plants do function, really prizing community, ecosystem longevity, and thriving over individual success. Now, that's not to say, I recognize I have chosen examples in this book that align with my life values and principles. There are certainly some cheaters out there. There are plants that don't all do that, but by and large, there is much more collaboration that happens in the plant kingdom than kind of individual achievement and celebration.
We have one question here. Is there an opinion about plants and how they can be used to battle depression in people as a preventative measure or after the fact? Yes. So I don't know. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't talk about that specifically in my book, but I do think that's part of the boom we've seen with people being drawn to houseplants during the pandemic. Houseplant care and gardening really does feed this kind of human need to care for another. And, whereas not everybody can bring pets into their space, nearly all of us can bring a plant into our space. Now, certainly some people were drawn to plants because they weren't sure if we were going to have food shortages, and they thought I might have to grow all my own food. But there actually is a well-known and documented practice during mental health counseling for time in nature and time caring for plants. So there are some people who actually use plant care in a part of clinical mental health practices. But certainly, I think a lot of just the boom we've also seen in interest in houseplants is part of the kind of joy that comes from taking care of something else and seeing it grow and thrive. And plants are a great depository for that kind of care and love.
Wonderful. Another question, are plants sociable with other plants? Is it true that you should talk to your plants, and do my plants compete with each other?
So it's, I'm smiling because I remember I was so precocious that my mom and some of her friends used to talk to their plants, and I told them this is useless. The only thing that's happening here is you're exhaling more carbon dioxide on them, right? And they're growing. So what we know is that plants talk to each other. Plants have a language. And we know that because if you have certain plants growing together, tomato plants are a great example. If you have tomato plants growing together and one of them is attacked by insects, that plant creates a mix of chemicals that is really a language that the neighboring plant detects and detects that as danger. So that's the language that says there's danger around. There are insects that are eating on our leaves. What happens when that second plant hears the danger language from the first is that the second plant, having not at all been attacked, starts to make a defense against these insects. And one of the defenses that they use is they make compounds that are anti-insect compound, anti-digestive. So if the insect munches on that leaves, it actually has chemicals that makes it sick and the insect can't thrive. And so we know that there's a language that happens above ground, and likewise roots can communicate. So frequently, if you take a tomato leaf and crush it in your hand, you can feel a little stickiness, but also you get a scent from it. That's the language. And a lot of the smells that we associate with plants, roses and others, what we're smelling is a chemical cocktail that's actually a language of the plant to either protect against insects, or in some cases, that is an invitation. It's the chemical language to attract a pollinator. So there is a lot of language that we know that happens. And in fact, some people have black walnut trees that they basically go into fruit, not every year, but there's a massive fruiting, and you will see all the walnut trees in the same area do that. And that's because as a community, they're communicating. And in one year, if they made a few fruit every year, the predators would eat those. But if you make a massive amount, there's too much and the predators can't eat it all. So the trees communicate. And in one year, all of the walnut trees in an area will drop their fruits at the same time. And so those kinds of things happen because the plants are talking to each other. Now, does it matter if we talk to our plants? So what we know is that plants do respond, not so much to our language, but plants respond to a number of cues, touch and other things. And it's not clear to us how human interaction directly impacts the growth of plants. But I always say, I think any living being that you have in your space, you should acknowledge it. It's my greatest joy when I'm on a Zoom call and a cat or dog comes in and someone stops and says, this is Maggie, right? Because they are individuals. And so I encourage people to talk to their plants, even if we don't, as scientists, don't really understand what the exact communication leads to in that regard, because you should always have a relationship with living beings in your space.
Great. Another question, where do you see or forecast your career in the next 20 years?
In 20 years, I will be retired or retiring. But one of the things that I have loved about debuting this first book is that I've been a professor for 17 years, almost 20 years now, and I have really loved my career, which is doing scientific experiments, training and mentoring students, teaching classes. I've enjoyed that. But the opportunities, and I think you asked this question before and I didn't really answer it in full, the conversations that I've been able to have with people of all walks of life who have an interest in the natural world, have an interest in plants, have an interest in thinking about their place on the planet and thriving, has really been enriching to me through reading, through debuting this book into the world. So I plan to write more books. I'm writing a second book now, maybe a third. And my dream would be 15 or 20 years now to be a full-time writer, but we'll see how that goes.
Wow. Can we ask what the book is about, the one that you're writing now?
Yeah, so I'm working on two. The one that I can talk about is really at the interface of African American history, plants, and plant expertise amongst people who were brought here to the United States.
Right. So a lot of history there. Wonderful. So you're really enjoying the writing process. That's great.
I do enjoy writing. Yeah.
What are some examples of plants that don't demonstrate these behaviors of collaboration that have stuck out to you? What lessons have you gained from observing them?
Yeah, so there are some plants, in some cases, some species of walnut, but also some smaller plants that actually don't collaborate, and they actively excrete compounds that cause their neighbors to get sick to protect their access to the space, right? Um, and I think, one of the kind of default responses would be, oh, how horrible. But the reality is that's part of a thriving ecosystem, that some organisms that still make significant contributions to the space, that they exist differently than others. And one of the jokes I've had about that is, oh, that plant is just a severe introvert, right? We all know introverts who need to be by themselves to replenish themselves. There are other plants that don't photosynthesize themselves, but they're still classified as plants, but they are actually, they live off of other plants. But what I understand is that part of their living off of other plants is part of the decomposition system. And one of the things we have to learn is to embrace the full cycle of an ecosystem that regenerates itself. And what I remind myself is that when we get to a point where we just want to protect the parts of the ecosystem that we exist without understanding this full cycle and a need for decomposition, a need for some life cycles to be short, part of that leads us to forest fires, right? Part of it is it's this kind of thing when we don't allow the ecosystem to kind of manage itself, or we don't intentionally manage it, then sometimes things can get out of control and there is catastrophe. And so, I love the growth and the competition and collaboration because it feeds me. But a real functioning ecosystem also has to have decomposition and turnover and all of those parts. So even when I learn about those, it's an invitation to understand how the full ecosystem works. And I think that's critically important as well, because the reality of our human lives is that not everything is peachy keen with our human lives. And that's part of understanding the full human experience as well.
Just wondering, the plants that send out the compounds to make their neighbors sick, is that their kin that they're making sick, or is it other plants that they're not related to?
It's generally other plants that they're not related to, although it's possible that it could be their kin, because usually what happens though is that over the course of evolutionary history, the way that those plants develop, their kin don't even germinate or grow right next to them. They get far spread. So it's usually plants that are not related to them.
Okay, so here's another question. I would like to know about growth projections in the field in general in the next 20 years. I'm not 100% sure what exactly that
Yeah, so that may be related to the fact that we have a lot of conversations over the years about as we deal with environmental changes in our climate, increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and such. People have over the years asked, what impact will that have on plants? And sometimes people have said, well, if we have increased carbon dioxide, maybe plants will grow better, or maybe they will grow more vigorously to deal with that. And I think what we're finding is that there's no one answer to that because it's so much species dependent. What we do know is that some certainly there are responses, short-term responses to change in carbon dioxide, but we also see shifts in the temperature. So some plants that used to only grow in Florida are now growing more north because of temperature shifts. And so because of all of these different parts of our environment changing, it's really complex to say with ease what's going to happen. And all of that, of course, is happening in a context where we have more storms, more floods, more fires, and that in and of itself shifts ecosystems as well. So it's much more complicated than I think we're able to predict with certainty per se.
Okay. So how about plants, the different kinds of leaders that we see in plants? So we have the trailblazers or the pioneers versus the long-term leaders, and how we can learn from that.
Yeah, so There are a couple of chapters in the book that kind of speak to that. Certainly the last chapter speaks deeply to leadership, but the chapter on ecological succession is one that really, I spent a lot of time thinking about that because over the years, as I've done different work, whether it's in mentoring or classroom instruction, all of it to me ultimately leads back to leadership and what kind of leaders we have. And part of what I've seen mostly in education, because that's where I am, but I also do significant work in the nonprofit sector, is that we often select for the same kind of leader. I can't tell you the number of times we've been about to hire someone and they're like, well, this person may only come and stay with us for a year. And so we should go with the person who's going to stay longer because it's a big investment to bring someone in. And over the years, when I've been observing that, I've asked, well, what if we brought someone in for a year and they completely changed our trajectory in greatly positive ways? Um, and there is this kind of default to bringing in long-term leaders that look like leaders we've always known. And part of my fascination with the ecological succession is that there's been a lot of conversation, particularly in the US, some in Canada that I'm aware of over the past couple of years, about a need for cultural change, whether that was around race relations or public health, or, we've had this globally. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we say we want cultural change and then we hire a very traditional long-term leader. And so I started to look for inspiration to question that. And one of the forms of inspiration was looking at what happens in nature. And I look at what happens during ecological succession as a form of cultural change. And this is going back to, it can happen after it can happen after an earthquake, after a flood, but many of us have seen an abandoned lot in our neighborhood, or we've seen flowers popping up in our asphalt or sidewalk. And if you leave that undisturbed, the first plants that can grow in those kinds of areas are known as pioneer plants. And that's because if you think about the crack of the sidewalk or an abandoned parking lot, that is not a rich ecosystem for plants to grow. You wouldn't expect plants to grow there. And so the pioneers are plants that don't require a lot of resources, but they can find an opening, a small crack where there are the limited resources that they need, moisture and some limited nutrients that allows the seed to germinate and the plant to grow. And that, the pioneers are really, they are trailblazers in that they are growing where they weren't expected to grow and making innovation with limited resources. In so doing, through their kind of growing, they may widen the crack, which may open up access for others to come. In their being in the space and dying, they create some organic matter that another plant may be able to use. So by pioneer plants being in the space, even if it's for a short term, if they have a successful life, they change the environment enough that plants that require more resources, that may have greater, capabilities in terms of what they're able to do as plants, can come in. And over time, you see that each of those plants changes the environment to the point where a bush or tree may be able to grow in a parking lot after 5 or 6 years, where that bush or tree would never have been able to grow there before. And so for me, that gave a powerful lesson about how we might need to think about leaders. If we truly want cultural change, we might need to bring in a pioneer who only wants to come in for a year or two, doesn't need a lot of resources, but has the innovation and behaviors and skills where they can make fast change. And they can change the environment in a way that others can come behind. And ultimately, you might lead towards being back at a place where you need a long-term leader. But it really, I think, gives us the idea that leadership has to be matched to what we say we want in the moment. We can't always look for the same thing all the time. And we can't be turned off by the fact that people will come in for a short term. The greatest example I think about, I have a sister who is in healthcare administration. And in healthcare administration, if you're doing a good job turning around a hospital's administration, in 2 or 3 years, another hospital is going to come after you. Well, we grew up in Arkansas where our parents came from very traditional careers. My dad worked as a banker for 30 years before he retired. My mom had the same career. And so I'll never forget, my mom didn't want to offend my sister, but she came to me after my sister had moved jobs every 2 years for about a decade. And she said, "Is your sister a good worker? I'm concerned." And I said, "That's why she's moving, because she's a good worker." But it's our limited conceptualization of what a pioneer leader is. And so I think if we think about those different forms of leadership and really ask ourselves what we need, it may change the way that we select and reward leaders. And so it just seemed to me that because many of us have seen that happen in nature, that it became a good analogy to get us to think about that in different contexts.
Right. I guess that kind of major change that a pioneer might bring is going to be uncomfortable, and we're not always prepared, I guess, even though we might think we are or say we are.
Yes.
Yeah, it's yeah.
Well, and to another question you asked earlier about, kind of what conversations I've had since the book came out. To be quite frank, I knew the one about growth would resonate with people. I've used that one for years. It's resonated. I didn't know how this cultural change. So many people have really resonated with this pioneer, because I think there are people who function as pioneers. And the thing about it is sometimes the pioneer is gone from the space before the impact is felt. And so to have a view of what the entire path is, and that maybe you won't be there to see the change, that's also a very powerful message for pioneers to get, because it can be difficult to be a pioneer because you're often working in isolation. You're working with limited resources. People don't necessarily appreciate the change you're trying to make their existence possible after you. And so that chapter has resonated so deeply with people in a way that has been really rewarding for me to get to experience as a writer.
Is that what happens to the plant pioneers? Like they go in and then do they either die or they just make way for other plants after?
They often die and leave seeds, right? So they leave another generation, but their existence is often very limited. And so they don't often experience the change that they make. And that we need more of that, even though that causes us great fear, because we don't know what change is going to come. And one of the things that I've been saying frequently is that one of the things I've noticed in this past year or two, while we've talked about change that we want to see in different spaces, is that many of us want change without changing. So we want the appearance of change, but we're scared to death of what that's going to mean to our life on a day-to-day basis. And I think until we can get ourselves to release what we know with the hope that what we might get is better, then we'll just, go along with what we have. But yeah, change is hard for people. And so that's been an interesting conversation to have. And I probably I'll come back to it in some fashion, but we'll see. Yeah.
I wonder if just one more point on that, hiring a leader with that in mind, that they're only going to I don't know if organizations do this, like purposely hire somebody just for a year or two with the intention that they allow them to be a pioneer and allow them to make those changes, knowing that they're not going to be somebody who they necessarily want to stick around for a long time. I don't know if that happens. But.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I've been looking at with a colleague of mine who we write about leadership, is that there are some spaces where that happens quite frequently in business. And so there are some areas of business and innovation where they recognize if you're going to shift the culture of a company, that you have to bring in a change leader. And so certain segments of business are much more open to that. Part of the conversations we've been trying to have is how do you get areas like nonprofit management and education and other spaces that need that, I think, but are resistant to it, to consider the possibilities. Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, here's another question. Any advice for somebody looking to get into the field? What type of schooling is needed, and any general advice?
So I'm assuming the field related to botany in some way. And I think the beauty of botany, like so many other areas, is that there's so many different ways to get into it. There's so many different avenues. And so there's applied botany. There's work that you can do in terms of in horticulture, or working in what I think of as the food culture farm space. And you certainly can study that in college. There also, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who is a practicing horticulturalist, and she got into it from being in 4-H. So she was actively involved in 4-H, which is at least a US youth thing where young people can get involved in almost a civic engagement with animals, plants, or others involved in. So she got involved in 4-H and ultimately did technical training to get into production horticulture. I happen to have gone all the way through graduate school, but we have people who work with me on a daily basis. Today, I was working with our greenhouse manager who oversees all of the greenhouses, and we can't do our research without him. And he did a bachelor's degree in biology. So there are lots of different ways to get into it. I think that whatever ways you get into it, there are internships to do so that you can experience many of these different career paths and have a little taste of them before making a commitment. And I always encourage people to do internships. It was an internship that actually got me to decide I wasn't going to law school and wanted to stay in this career. So I think internships are a great way to do it. Career shadowing. I have people who've shadowed me for a while. And so I think a lot of different things that you can do to think about getting into the field.
Wonderful. So I really wanted to, we're heading towards the end now, but I wanted to read.
Well, that went fast.
I know it did. I did. This is a great quote towards the end of the book. Not until we begin to embrace the diversity of the individuals who may come to these positions, the unique experiences, gifts, and skills each person possesses, will we fully experience the wealth of unique flowers that each has to offer when encouraged to bloom. So that's speaking about leaders and managers and being groundskeepers instead of gatekeepers.
Yeah, and I would say that I think about it certainly in that context, that I think from a leadership perspective, too frequently when we hire people, we have a preconceived notion of how we want people to contribute. And unless you're producing a product like an iPhone that has to be exactly the same, too frequently, we still have that same mentality in contexts where it need not be, where people could bring their own personal experience. So I think about it from leadership. How do we get leaders to ask what unique contributions do people have and encourage that? But to be quite frank with you, I think about it in community. One of the ways in which I became the person I was is that my mom and dad didn't have any preconceived idea of who I should be. And I think sometimes we raise our kids with a preconceived idea of who they should be. My mom's approach was always, even if she saw a flicker of a flame, and she called it strange fire. Like, she's like, I don't understand that. Usually our response is to blow out strange fire if we don't recognize it. Her response was always, how do I help you protect your unique flame so it doesn't burn out of control and take you out, but you actually just protect it and cultivate it. And I think about that in relationships and in my friendships and in the ways in which I engage. How are we recognizing what someone's kind of unique passion is, their unique kind of set of skills, and how do we help them cultivate that? And I think, too frequently, because we usually try to reproduce ourselves through mentoring, through leadership, as opposed to asking what unique gifts people have, I think we as the ecosystem is worse off when people don't bring their unique gifts. And using myself as an example, when I started being interested in writing about lessons from plants, all of my mentors said, you are a biochemist. That is not what biochemists do. Focus. And yet the conversations I've been able to have in the simple 6 months since this book has been out has enriched my my own life in ways that I can't even imagine. And so I think about not just, this, I'm one example, but there are so many people who, because we don't encourage them to be unique, we encourage them to replay these tried and true paths of success. I think we're suffering from not receiving their gifts. And that's one of the things that, if I spend any time and stop and think about the massive loss of life that we've experienced in the pandemic, that in and of itself is overwhelming, but also all the unique contributions that those individuals would have made. It really inspires me not to miss a day asking, not how can I get someone to do what I've done? How can I really ask what unique contributions they have to make to the planet and what role I could have in any way in helping bring those forward? And so I do think it is about leadership, but it's also about how we are with each other on the planet.
Beautiful. Somebody is asking, do you have any of your college classes online? Is that a MOOC? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't, but I'm thinking about one either related to this book or some other topics that I have done.
Okay. One last comment here. I study mitochondria and I know that plants have mitochondria, and are they similar to our mitochondria, and how does mitosis happen? And do they have the same motor molecules of kinesin or dynein in us?
Yeah, so in many ways, the mitochondria of plants are highly similar to mitochondria that are found in animal systems. Certainly, there are a few different components, the structural components, but by and large, the activities that mitochondria carry out seem to be the same across the plant kingdom as they are in the animal kingdom.
Okay. So maybe we'll finish up with, I just was wondering if you have one particular plant that is really the most inspiring to you at the moment.
Yeah, so I do have a couple of plants that have been quite inspiring. A few of them are lilies that a couple of them I received after my father passed away in 2019, and none of them were supposed to live this long. And so it's been really fun to have the time during the pandemic to take care of those plants, to learn a lot about those plants. Also, I spent, because I wasn't traveling this year as much as, thank you for your condolences. Because I wasn't traveling this year as much as I usually do, I had real fun growing a few vegetables that I have never grown before. And I grew spaghetti squash just because I love spaghetti squash so much. I decided that I wanted to grow some of the vegetables that I love the most because I was sure they would taste even better because I grew them in my own hand, and that was true. And then I have one, it's not a plant, it's a tree, but the tree that I planted with my son, that I talk about at the end of the book. Of course, that's one of my favorite plants, and he's away at college now, but sometimes I FaceTime him so he can see his tree if something's going on with it. And so that's been a real touch point for us as mom and son. So
It's been a really great conversation, and it's been wonderful to have everybody here contributing and asking questions.
absolutely.
Really want to thank you, and really want to congratulate you on such a great book that we can read over and over again.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have this conversation, and I am so grateful. I understand people could be anywhere. So I thank all of you for taking the time to be here to listen and to engage. And I wish you all good health and safety as we continue to try to emerge from the pandemic.
You too, and we're looking forward to your future books.
Thank you so very much. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye.